Welcome. Tonight we journey into a rare and chilling tale by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, best known for creating Sherlock Holmes, but also a master of darker stories that delve into the monstrous side of human nature. A Pastoral Horror is a haunting exploration of madness, cruelty, and transformation. A werewolf story of sorts, though no full moon nor magic is required. Instead, it shows how the beast can rise from within the man himself. I invite you now to listen and to consider how thin the line can be between humanity and horror. A Pastoral Horror by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Far above the level of the Lake of Constance, nestling in a little corner of the Tyrolese Alps, lies the quiet town of Feldkirch. It is remarkable for nothing, save for the presence of a large and well-conducted Jesuit school and for the extreme beauty of its situation. There is no more lovely spot in the whole of the Vorarlberg. From the hills which rise behind the town, the great lake glimmers some 15 miles off, like a broad sea of quicksilver. Down below in the plains, the Rhine and the Danube prattle along, flowing swiftly and merrily, with none of the dignity which they assume as they grow from brooks into rivers. 5 great countries or principalities, Switzerland, Austria, Baden, Württemberg, and Bavaria, are visible from the plateau of Feldkirch. Feldkirch is the centre of a large tract of hilly and pastoral country. The main road runs through the centre of the town, and then on as far as Ansbach, where it divides into 2 branches, one of which is larger than the other. This more important one runs through the valleys across Austrian Tyrol into Tyrol proper, going as far, I believe, as the capital of Innsbruck. The lesser road runs for 8 or 10 miles amid wild and rugged glens to the village of Laden, where it breaks up into a network of sheep tracks. In this quiet spot, I, John Hudson, spent nearly 2 years of my life, from the June of 65 to the March of 67, and it was during that time that these events occurred, which for some weeks brought the retired hamlet into an unholy prominence, and caused its name for the first, and probably for the last time, to be a familiar word to the European press. The short account of these incidents which appeared in the English papers was, however, inaccurate and misleading, besides which the rapid advance of the Prussians, culminating in the Battle of Sadowa, attracted public attention away from what might have moved it deeply in less troublesome times. It seems to me that the facts may be detailed now, and be new to the great majority of readers, especially as I was myself intimately connected with the drama, and am in a position to give many particulars which have never before been made public. And first, a few words as to my own presence in this out-of-the-way spot. When the great city firm of Spring, Wilkinson and Sprague failed, and paid their creditors rather less than 18 pence in the pound, a number of humble individuals were ruined, including myself. There was, however, some legal objection which held out a chance of my being made an exception to the other creditors and being paid in full. While the case was being brought out, I was left with a very small sum for my subsistence. I determined, therefore, to take up my residence abroad in the interim, since I could live more economically there, and be spared the mortification of meeting those who had known me in my more prosperous days. A friend of mine had described Laden to me some years before as being the most isolated place which he had ever come across in all his experience, and as isolation and cheap living are usually synonymous, I bethought use of his words. Besides, I was in a cynical humour with my fellow man, and desired to see as little of him as possible for some time to come. Obeying then the guidances of poverty and of misanthropy, I made my way to Laden, where my arrival created the utmost excitement among the simple inhabitants. The manners and customs of the red-bearded Englander, his long walks, his check suit, and the reasons which had led him to abandon his fatherland, were all fruitful sources of gossip to the topers who frequented the Grüner Mann and the Schwarze Bar, the 2 alehouses of the village. I found myself very happy at Laden. The surroundings were magnificent, and 20 years at Brixton had sharpened my admiration for nature as an olive improves the flavour of wine. In my youth I had been a fair German scholar, and I found myself able, before I had been many months abroad, to converse even on scientific and abstruse subjects with the new curé of the parish. This priest was a great godsend to me, for he was a most learned man and a brilliant conversationalist. Father Verhagen, for that was his name, though little more than 40 years of age, had made his reputation as an author by a brilliant monograph upon the early popes, a work which eminent critics have compared favourably with von Ranke's. I shrewdly suspect that it was owing to some rather unorthodox views advanced in this book that Verhagen was relegated to the obscurity of Leyden. His opinions upon every subject were ultra-liberal, and in his fiery youth he had been ready to vindicate them, as was proved by a deep scar across his chin, received from a dragoon's sabre in the abortive insurrection at Berlin. Although the man was an interesting one, and though he was by nature somewhat cold and reserved, we soon established an acquaintanceship. The atmosphere of morality in Leyden was a very rarefied one. The position of Intendant Worms and his satellites had for many years been a sinecure. Non-attendance at church upon a Sunday or feast day was about the deepest and darkest crime which the most advanced of the villagers had attained to. Occasionally some hulking Fritz or Andreas would come lurching home at 10 o'clock at night, slightly under the influence of Bavarian beer, and might even abuse the wife of his bosom if she ventured to remonstrate. But such cases were rare, and when they occurred the Lardners looked at the culprit for some time in a half-admiring, half-horrified manner, as one who had committed a gaudy sin and so asserted his individuality. It was in this peaceful village that a series of crimes suddenly broke out which astonished all Europe, and for atrocity and for the mystery which surrounded them surpassed anything of which I have ever heard or read. I shall endeavour to give a succinct account of these events in the order of their sequence, in which I am much helped by the fact that it has been my custom all my life to keep a journal, to the pages of which I now refer. It was then, I find upon the 19th of May in the spring of 1866, that my old landlady, Frau Zimmer, rushed wildly into the room as I was sipping my morning cup of chocolate and informed me that a murder had been committed in the village. At first I could hardly believe the news, but as she persisted in her statement and was evidently terribly frightened, I put on my hat and went out to find the truth. When I came into the main street of the village, I saw several men hurrying along in front of me, and following them, I came upon an excited group in front of the little Stadthouse or town hall, a barn-like edifice which was used for all manner of public gatherings. They were collected round the body of one Mall, who had formerly been a steward upon one of the steamers running between Lindau and Frederikshavn on the Lake of Constance. He was a harmless, inoffensive little man, generally popular in the village, and as far as was known, without an enemy in the world. Maule lay upon his face, with his fingers dug into the earth, no doubt in his last convulsive struggles, and his hair all matted together with blood, which had streamed down over the collar of his coat. The body had been discovered nearly 2 hours, but no one appeared to know what to do or whether to convey it. My arrival, however, together with that of the curé, who came with us simultaneously, infused some vigour into the crowd. Under our direction, the corpse was carried up the steps and laid on the floor of the town hall, where, having made sure that life was extinct, we proceeded to examine the injuries in conjunction with Lieutenant Worms of the police. Maule's face was perfectly placid, showing that he had no thought of danger until the fatal blow was struck. His watch and purse had not been taken. Upon washing the clotted blood from the back of his head, a singular triangular wound was found, which had smashed the bone and penetrated deeply into the brain. It had evidently been inflicted by a heavy blow from a sharp, pointed, pyramidal instrument. I believe that it was Father Verhagen, the curé, who suggested the probability of the weapon in question having been a short mattock or small pickaxe, such as are to be found in every alpine cottage. The intendant, with praiseworthy promptness, at once obtained one, and striking a turnip, produced just such a curious gap as to be seen in poor Maule's head. We felt that we had come upon the first link of a chain which might guide us to the assassin. It was not long before we seemed to grasp the whole clue. A sort of inquest was held upon the body that same afternoon, at which Fifor, the mayor, proceeded, the curé, the intendant, Freckler of the post office, and myself forming ourselves into a sort of committee of investigation. Any villager who could throw a light upon the case or give an account of the movements of the murdered man upon the previous evening was invited to attend. There was a fair muster of witnesses, and we soon gathered a connected series of facts. At 8:30, Maule had entered the Grunermann public house and had called for a flagon of beer. At that time there was sitting in the tap room Waghorn, the butcher of the village, and an Italian pedlar named Cellini, who used to come 3 times a year to Larden with cheap jewellery and other wares. Immediately after his entrance, the landlord had seated himself with his customers, and the 4 had spent the evening together, the common villagers not being admitted behind the bar. It seemed, from the evidence of the landlord and of Waghorn, both of whom were most respectable and trustworthy men, that shortly after 9 o'clock a dispute arose between the deceased and the pedlar. Hot words had been exchanged, and the Italian had eventually left the room, saying that he would not stay any longer to hear his country decried. Maule remained for nearly an hour, and being somewhat elated at having caused his adversary's retreat, he drank rather more than was usual with him. One witness had met him walking towards his home about 10 o'clock, and deposed to his having been slightly the worse for drink. Another had met him just a minute or so before he reached the spot in front of the Stadthouse where the deed was done. The man's evidence was most important. He swore confidently that while passing the town hall and before meeting Maule, he had seen a figure standing in the shadow of the building, adding that the person appeared to him, as far as he could make him out, to be not unlike the Italian. Up to this point, we had then established 2 facts: that the Italian had left the Grunermann before Maule, with words of anger on his lips. The second, that some unknown individual had been seen lying in wait on the road, which the ex-steward would have to traverse. A third, and most important, was reached when the woman with whom the Italian lodged disposed that he had not returned the night before until 10:30, an unusually late hour for Larden. How had he employed his time, then, from shortly after 9, when he left the public house, until 10:30, when he returned to his rooms? Things were beginning to look very black indeed against the pedlar. It could not be denied, however, that there were points in the man's favour, and that the case against him consisted entirely of circumstantial evidence. In the first place, there was no sign of a mattock or any other instrument which could have been used for such a purpose among the Italian's goods, nor was it easy to understand how he could come by any such a weapon, since he did not go home between the time of the quarrel and his final return. Again, as the curé pointed out, since Cellini was a comparative stranger in the village, it was very unlikely that he would know which road Maule would take in order to reach his home. The objection was weakened, however, by the evidence of the dead man's servant, who deposed that the pedlar had been hulking his wares in front of their house the day before, and might very possibly have seen the owner at one of the windows. As to the prisoner himself, his attitude at first had been one of defiance, and even of amusement, but when he began to realise the weight of evidence against him, his manner became cringing, and he wrung his hands hideously, loudly proclaiming his innocence. His defence was that, after leaving the inn, he had taken a long walk down the Anspach road in order to cool down his excitement, and that this was the cause of his late return. As to the murder of Maule, he knew no more about it than the babe unborn. I have dwelt at some length upon the circumstances of this case, because there are events in connection with it which makes it peculiarly interesting. I intend now to fall back upon my diary, which was very fully kept during this period, and indeed during my whole residence abroad. It will save me trouble to quote from it, and it will be a teacher for the accuracy of facts. May 20th. Nothing thought of and nothing talked of but the recent tragedy. A hunt has been made among the woods and along the brook in the hope of finding the weapon of the assassin. The more I think of it, the more convinced I am that Cellini is the man. The fact of the money being untouched proves that the crime was committed for motives of revenge, and who would bear more spite towards poor innocent Mal, except the vindictive, hot-blooded Italian whom he had just offended? I dined with Pfeiffer in the evening, and he entirely agreed with me in my view of the case. May 21st. Still no word, as far as I can hear, which throws any light upon the murder. Poor Mal was buried at 12 o'clock in the neat little village churchyard. The curé led the service with great feeling, and his audience, consisting of the whole population of the village, were much moved, interrupting him frequently by sobs and ejaculations of grief. After the painful ceremony was over, I had a short walk with our good priest. His naturally excitable nature had been considerably stirred by recent events. His hand trembles, and his face is pale. "My friend," said he, taking me by the hand as we walked together, "you know something of medicine." I had been 2 years at Guy's. "I have been far from well of late." "It is this sad affair which has upset you," I said. "No," he answered, "I have felt it coming on for some time, but it has been worse of late. I have a pain which shoots from here to there." He put his hand to his temples. "If I were struck by lightning, the sudden shock it causes me could not be more great. At times when I close my eyes, flashes of light dart before them, and my ears are for ever ringing. Often I know not what I do. My fear is lest I faint some time when performing the holy offices." "You are overworking yourself," I said. "You must have rest and strengthening tonics. Are you writing just now? And how much do you do each day?" 8 hours, he answered, sometimes 10, sometimes even 12, when the pains in my head do not interrupt me. "You must reduce it to 4, I said authoritatively. "You must also take regular exercise. I shall send you some quinine which I have in my trunk, and you can take as much as would cover a gulden in a glass of milk every morning and night." He departed, vowing that he would follow my directions. I hear from the mayor that 4 policemen are to be sent from Anspach to remove Cellini to a safer jail. May 22nd. To say that I was startled would give but a faint idea of my mental state. I am confounded, amazed, horrified beyond all expression. Another and a more dreadful crime has been committed during the night. Freckler has been found dead in his house. The very Freckler who had sat with me on the committee of investigation the day before. I write these notes after a long and anxious day's work, during which I have been endeavouring to assist the officers of the law. The villagers are so paralysed with fear at this fresh evidence of an assassin in their midst, that there would be a general panic but for our exertions. It appears that Freckler, who was a man of peculiar habits, lived alone in an isolated dwelling. Some curiosity was aroused this morning by the fact that he had not gone to his work, and that there was no sign of movement about the house. A crowd assembled, and the doors were eventually forced open. The unfortunate Freckler was found in the bedroom upstairs, lying with his head in the fireplace. He had met his death by an exactly similar wound to that which had proved fatal to Maul, save that in this instance the injury was in front. His hands were clenched, and there was an indescribable look of horror, and, as it seemed to me, of surprise upon his features. There were marks of muddy footprints upon the stairs, which must have been caused by the murderer in his ascent, as the victim had put on his slippers before retiring to his bedroom. These prints, however, were too much blurred to enable us to get a trustworthy outline of the foot. They were only to be found upon every 3rd step, showing with what fiendish swiftness this human tiger had rushed upstairs in search of his victim. There was a considerable sum of money in the house, but not 1 farthing had been touched, nor had any of the drawers in the bedroom been opened. As the dismal news became known, the whole population of the village assembled in a great crowd in front of the house, rather, I think, from the gregariousness of terror than from mere curiosity. Every man looked with suspicion upon his neighbour. Most were silent, and when they spoke it was in whispers, as if they feared to raise their voices. None of these people were allowed to enter the house, and we, the more enlightened members of the community, made a strict examination of the premises. There was absolutely nothing, however, to give the slightest clue as to the assassin. Beyond the fact that he must be an active man, judging from the manner in which he ascended the stairs, we have gained nothing from this second tragedy. Intendant Worms pointed out, indeed, that the dead man's rigid right arm was stretched out as if in greeting, and that therefore it was probable that this late visitor was someone with whom Freckler was well acquainted. This, however, was to a large extent conjecture. If anything could have added to the horror created by the dreadful occurrence, it was the fact that the crime must have been committed at the early hour of 8:30 in the evening, that being the time registered by a small cuckoo clock which had been carried away by Freckler in his fall. No one, apparently, heard any suspicious sounds or saw anyone enter or leave the house. It was done rapidly, quietly, and completely, though many people must have been about at the time. Poor Pfeiffer and our good curé are terribly cut up by the awful occurrence, and indeed I feel very much depressed myself, now that all the excitement is over and the reaction set in. There are very few of the villagers about this evening, but from every side is heard the sound of hammering, the peasants fitting bolts and bars upon the doors and windows of their houses. Very many of them have been entirely unprovided with anything of the sort, nor were they ever required until now. Frau Zimmer has manufactured a huge fastening, which would be ludicrous if we were in a humour for laughter. I hear tonight that Cellini has been released, as, of course, there is no possible pretext for detaining him now. Also, that word has been sent to all the villagers near for any police that can be spared. My nerves have been so shaken that I remained awake the greater part of the night, reading Gordon's translation of Tacitus by candlelight. I have got out my navy revolver and cleaned it so as to be ready for all eventualities. May the 23rd, the police force has been recruited by 3 more men from Ansbach and 2 from Thalstadt at the other side of the hills. Intendant Worms has established an efficient system of patrols so that we may consider ourselves reasonably safe. Today has cast no light upon the murders. The general opinion in the village seems to be that they have been done by some stranger who lies concealed among the woods. They argue that they have all known each other since childhood, and that there is no one of their number who would be capable of such actions. Some of the more daring of them have made a hunt among the pine forests today, but without success. May 24th. Events crowd on apace. We seem hardly to have recovered from one horror when something else occurs to excite the popular imagination. Fortunately, this time it is not a fresh tragedy, although the news is serious enough. The murderer has been seen, and that upon the public road, which proves that his thirst for blood has not been quenched yet, and also that our reinforcements of police are not enough to guarantee security. I have just come back from hearing Andreas Murch narrate his experience, though he is still in such a state of trepidation that his story is somewhat incoherent. He was belated among the hills, it seems, owing to mist. It was nearly 11 o'clock before he struck the main road, about a couple of miles from the village. He confesses that he felt by no means comfortable at finding himself out so late after the recent occurrences. However, as the fog had cleared away and the moon was shining brightly, he trudged sturdily along. Just about a quarter of a mile from the village, the road takes a very sharp bend. Andreas had got as far as this when he suddenly heard in the still night the sound of footsteps approaching rapidly around this curve. Overcome with fear, he threw himself into the ditch which skirts the road and lay there motionless in the shadow, peering over the side. The steps came nearer and nearer, and then a tall dark figure came round the corner at a swinging pace, and passing the spot where the moon glimmered upon the white face of the frightened peasant, halted in the road about 20 yards further on, and began probing about among the reeds on the roadside with an instrument which Andreas Murch recognised with horror as being a long mattock. After searching about in this way for a minute or so, as if he had suspected that someone was concealed there, for he must have heard the sound of the footsteps. He stood still, leaning upon his weapon. Murch describes him as a tall, thin man dressed in clothes of a darkish colour. The lower part of his face was swathed in a wrapper of some sort, and the little which was visible appeared to be of a ghastly pallor. Murch could not see enough of his features to identify him, but thinks that it was no one whom he had ever seen in his life before. After standing for some little time, the man with the mattock had walked swiftly away into the darkness, in the direction in which he imagined the fugitive had gone. Andreas, as may be supposed, lost little time in getting safely into the village, where he alarmed the police. 3 of them, armed with carbines, started down the road, but saw no signs of the miscreant. There is, of course, a possibility that Murch's story is exaggerated and that his imagination has been sharpened by fear. Still, the whole incident cannot be trumped up, and this awful demon who haunts us all evidently still active. Still, the whole incident cannot be trumped up, and this awful demon who haunts us is evidently still active. There is an ill-conditioned fellow named Heidler, who lives in a hut on the side of the Spiegelberg and supports himself by chamois hunting and by acting as guide to the few tourists who find their way here. Popular suspicion has fastened on this man, for no better reason than that he is tall, thin, and known to be rough and brutal. His chalet has been searched today, but nothing of importance found. He has, however, been arrested and confined in the same room which Cellini used to occupy. At this point, there is a gap of a week in my diary, during which time there was an entire cessation of the constant alarms which have harassed us daily. Some explained it by supposing that the terrible unknown had moved on to some fresh and less guarded scene of operations. Others imagined that we have secured the right man in the shape of the vagabond Heidler. Be the cause what it may, peace and contentment reign once more in the village, and a short 7 days have sufficed to clear away the cloud of care from men's brows, though the police are still on the alert. The season for rifle shooting is beginning, and as Laden has, like every other Tyrolese village, butts of its own, there is a continual pop, pop, all day. These peasants are dead shots up to about 400 yards. No troops in the world could subdue them among their native mountains. My friend Verhagen, the curé, and Pfeiffer, the mayor, used to go down in the afternoon to see the shooting with me. The former says that the quinine has done him much good and that his appetite is improved. We all agree that it is good policy to encourage the amusements of the people so that they may forget all about this wretched business. Waghorn, the butcher, won the prize offered by the mayor. He made 5 bulls and what we should call a magpie out of 6 shots at 100 yards. This is English prize medal form. June the 2nd. Who could have imagined that a day which opened so fairly could have so dark an ending? The early carrier brought me a letter by which I learned that Spragg & Co. have agreed to pay my claim in full, although it may be some months before the money is forthcoming. This will make a difference of nearly £400 a year to me, a matter of moment when a man is in his 7th and 40th year. And now for the grand events of the hour. My interview with the vampire who haunts us and his attempt upon Frau Bischoff, the landlady of the Grüne Mann, to say nothing of the narrow escape of the good curé. There seems to be something almost supernatural in the malignity of this unknown fiend and the impunity with which he continues his murderous course. The real reason of it lies in the badly lit state of the place, or rather the entire absence of light, and also in the fact that thick woods stretch right down to the houses on every side so that escape is made easy. In spite of this, however, he had 2 very narrow escapes tonight, one from my pistol and one from the officers of the law. I shall not sleep much, so I may spend half an hour in jotting down these strange doings in my diary. I am no coward, but life in Leyden is becoming too much for my nerves. I believe the matter will end in the emigration of the whole population. To come to my story, then. I felt lonely and depressed this evening, in spite of the good news of the morning. About 9 o'clock, just as night began to fall, I determined to stroll over and call upon the curé, thinking that a little intellectual chat might cheer me up. I slipped my revolver into my pocket, therefore, a precaution which I never neglected, and went out, very much against the advice of good Frau Zimmer. I think I mentioned some months ago in my diary that the curate's house is some little way out of the village upon the brow of a small hill. When I arrived there, I found that he had gone out, which indeed I might have anticipated, for he had complained lately of restlessness at night, and I had recommended him to take a little exercise in the evening. His housekeeper made me very welcome, however, and having lit the lamp, left me in the study with some books to amuse me until her master's return. I suppose I must have sat for nearly half an hour glancing over an odd volume of Klopstock's poems when some sudden instinct caused me to raise my head and look up. I have been in some strange situations in my life, but never have I felt anything to be compared to the thrill which shot through me at that moment. The recollection of it now, hours after the event, makes me shudder. There, framed in one of the panes of the window, was a human face glaring in, from the darkness, into the lighted room. The face of a man so concealed by a cravat and slouch hat that the only impression I retain of it was a pair of wild beast eyes and a nose which was whitened by being pressed against the glass. It did not need Andreas Murcher's description to tell me that at last I was face to face with the man with the mattock. There was murder in those wild eyes. For a second I was so unstrung as to be powerless. The next I cocked my revolver and fired straight at the sinister face. I was a moment too late. As I pressed the trigger I saw it vanish, but the pane through which it had looked was shattered to pieces. I rushed to the window and then out through the front door, but everything was silent. There was no trace of my visitor. His intention, no doubt, was to attack the curé, for there was nothing to prevent his coming through the folding window had he not found an armed man inside. As I stood in the cool night air with the curé's frightened housekeeper beside me, I suddenly heard a great hubbub down in the village. By this time, alas, such sounds were so common in Lardent that there was no doubting what it foreboded. Some fresh misfortune had occurred there. Tonight seemed destined to be a night of horror. My presence might be of use in the village, so I sat off there, taking with me the trembling woman who positively refused to remain behind. There was a crowd round the Gruner Mann public house, and a dozen excited voices were explaining the circumstances to the curé, who had arrived just before us. It was, as I had thought, though happily without the result which I had feared. Frau Bischoff, the wife of the proprietor of the inn, had, it seems, gone some 20 minutes before a few yards from her door to draw some water, and had been at once attacked by a tall disguised man who had cut at her with some weapon. Fortunately, he had slipped, so that she was able to seize him by the wrist and prevent his repeating his attempt while she screamed for help. There were several people about at the time who came running towards them, on which the stranger wrested himself free and dashed off into the woods, with 2 of our police after him. There was little hope of their overtaking or tracing him, however, in such a dark labyrinth. Frau Bischoff had made a bold attempt to hold the assassin, and declares that her nails made deep furrows in his right wrist. This, however, must be mere conjecture, as there was very little light at the time. She knows no more of the man's features than I do. Fortunately, she is entirely unhurt. The curé was horrified when I informed him of the incident at his own house. He was returning from his walk, it appears, when hearing cries in the village he had hurried down to it. I have not told anyone else of my own adventure, for the people are quite excited enough already. As I said before, unless this mysterious and bloodthirsty villain is captured, the place will become deserted. Flesh and blood cannot stand such a strain. He is either some murderous misanthrope who has declared a vendetta against the whole human race, or else he is an escaped maniac. Clearly, after the unsuccessful attempt upon Frau Bischoff, he had made at once for the curé's house, bent upon slaking his thirst for blood, and thinking that its lonely situation gave hope of success. I wish I had fired at him through the pocket of my coat. The moment he saw the glitter of the weapon, he was off. June the 3rd. Everybody in the village this morning has learned about the attempt upon the curé last night. There was quite a crowd at his house to congratulate him on his escape, and when I appeared, they raised a cheer and hailed me as the Tapferer Englander. It seems that his narrow shave must have given the ruffian a great start, for a thick woolen muffler was found lying on the pathway leading down to the village, and later in the day the fatal mattock was discovered close to the same place. The scoundrel evidently threw these things down and they took to his heels. It is possible that he may prove to have been frightened away from the neighbourhood altogether. Let us trust so. June the 4th. A quiet day, which is as remarkable a thing in our annals as an exciting one elsewhere. Worms has made strict inquiry, but cannot trace the muffler at mattock to any inhabitant. A description of them has been printed and copies sent to Anspach and neighbouring villages for circulation among the peasants, who may be able to throw some light upon the matter. A Thanksgiving service is to be held in the church on Sunday for the double escape of the pastor and of Martha Bischoff. Pfeiffer tells me that Herr von Weissendorf, one of the most energetic detectives in Vienna, is on his way to Leyden. I see, too, by the English papers sent me, that people at home are interested in the tragedies here, although the accounts which have reached them are garbled and untrustworthy. How well I can recall the Sunday morning following upon the events which I have described, such a morning as it is hard to find outside the Tyrol. The sky was blue and cloudless. The gentle breeze wafted the balsamic odour of the pine woods through the open windows, and away up the hills the distant tinkling of the cowbells fell pleasantly upon the ear, until the musical rise and fall which summoned the villagers to prayer drowned their feebler melody. It was hard to believe, looking down that peaceful little street with its quaint top-heavy wooden houses and old-fashioned church, that a cloud of crime hung over it which had horrified Europe. I sat at my window, watching the peasants passing with their picturesquely dressed wives and daughters on their way to church. With the kindly reverence of Catholic countries, I saw them cross themselves as they went by the house of Freckler and the spot where Maul had met his fate. When the bell had ceased to toll and the whole population had assembled in the church, I walked up there also, for it has always been my custom to join in the religious exercises of any people among whom I may find myself. When I arrived at the church, I found that the service had already begun. I took my place in the gallery which contained the village organ, from which I had a good view of the congregation. In the front seat of all was stationed Frau Bischoff, whose miraculous escape the service was intended to celebrate, and beside her on one side was her worthy spouse, while the mayor occupied the other. There was a hush through the church as the curé turned from the altar and ascended the pulpit. I have seldom heard a more magnificent sermon. Father Verhagen was always an eloquent preacher, but on that occasion he surpassed himself. He chose for his text, "In the midst of life we are in death," and impressed so vividly upon our minds the thin veil which divides us from eternity, and how unexpectedly it may be rent, that he held his audience spellbound and horrified. He spoke next with tender pathos of the friends who had been snatched so suddenly and so dreadfully from among us, until his words were almost drowned by the sobs of the women, and suddenly turning, he compared their peaceful existence in a happier land to the dark fate of the gloomy-minded criminal, steeped in blood and with nothing to hope for either in the world or the next. A man solitary among his fellows, with no woman to love him, no child to prattle at his knee, and an endless torture in his own thoughts. So skilfully and so powerfully did he speak, that as he finished, I am sure that pity for this merciless demon was the prevailing emotion in every heart. The service was over, and the priest, with his two acolytes before him, was leaving the altar, when he turned, as was his custom, to give his blessing to the congregation. I shall never forget his appearance. The summer sunshine, shining slantwise through the single small stained-glass window which adorned the little church, threw a yellow lustre upon his sharp intellectual features with their dark haggard lines, while a vivid crimson spot reflected from a ruby-coloured mantle in the window quivered over his uplifted right hand. There was a hush as the villagers bent their heads to receive their pastor's blessing, a hush broken by a wild exclamation of surprise from a woman who staggered to her feet in the front pew and gesticulated frantically as she pointed at Father Verhagen's uplifted arm. No need for Frau Bischoff to explain the cause of that sudden cry, for there, in full sight of his parishioners, were lines of livid scars upon the curé's white wrist, scars which could be left by nothing on earth but a desperate woman's fingernails. And what woman save her, who had clung so fiercely to the murderer 2 days before? That, in all this terrible business, poor Verhagen was the man most to be pitied, I have no manner of doubt. In a town in which there was good medical advice to be had, the approach of the homicidal mania which had undoubtedly proceeded from overwork and brain worry, and which assumed such a terrible form, would have been detected in time, and he would have been spared the awful compunction with which he must have been seized in the lucid intervals between his fits, if indeed he had any lucid intervals. How could I diagnose with my smattering of science the existence of such a terrible and insidious form of insanity, especially from the vague symptoms of which he informed me? It is easy now, looking back, to think of many little circumstances which might have put us on the right scent, but what a simple thing is retrospective wisdom! I should be sad indeed if I thought that I had anything with which to reproach myself. We were never able to discover where he had obtained the weapon with which he had committed his crimes, nor how he managed to secrete it in the interval. My experience proved that it had been his custom to go and come through his study window without disturbing his housekeeper. On the occasion of the attempt on Frau Bischoff, he had made a dash for home, and then, finding to his astonishment that his room was occupied, his only resource was to fling away his weapon and muffler and to mix with the crowd in the village. Being both a strong and an active man, with a good knowledge of the footpaths through the woods, he had never found any difficulty in escaping all observation. Immediately after his apprehension, Verhagen's disease took an acute form, and he was carried off to the lunatic asylum at Feldkirch. I have heard that some months later he made a determined attempt upon the life of one of his keepers, and afterwards committed suicide. I cannot be positive of this, however, for I have heard it quite accidentally during the conversation in a railway carriage. As for myself, I left Leyden within a few months, having received a pleasing intimation from my solicitors that my claim had been paid in full. In spite of my tragic experience there, I had many a pleasing recollection of the little Tyrolese village, and in 2 subsequent visits I renewed my acquaintance with the mayor, the intendant, and all my old friends, on which occasion, over long pipes and flagons of beer, we have taken a grim pleasure in talking with bated breath of that terrible month in the quiet Vorarlberg hamlet.